Hello, everyone. Welcome to our program today on ancient Greek homoeroticism and modern queer beauty in honor of Pride Month. My name is Shelby Brown, and on behalf of the Getty Villa, it is my pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Professor Whitney Davis, and to help manage the Q&A. The Villa is the home of the Getty Museum's Antiquities Collection, and all our talks relate to the ancient world. Today, Whitney's presentation starts in ancient Greece and spans a few thousand years. Whitney Davis is professor in the Graduate School at the University of California at Berkeley and Pardee Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History and Theory of Ancient and Modern Art. He currently serves as Distinguished Scientist and Scholar of the Nomis Foundation in Zurich, for which he leads a multidisciplinary 5-year research project on the nature and history of visual culture. In pursuing his PhD at Harvard, Whitney's interests in antiquity embraced prehistoric Egyptian, Greek, and Roman art, and his focus has since expanded ever outward to incorporate too many topics to name, but you can check them out by clicking on the link to his webpage in the chat. His interests include the classical tradition in Western art, the development of professional art history and its problematic place in the humanities, queer theory, and the global history of visual culture. Whitney has published over 125 articles in journals, edited volumes, exhibition catalogs, and conference proceedings, and he is the multiple prize-winning author of 10 books. I will name just a few. Especially relevant to his topic today is Queer Beauty, Sexuality and Aesthetics from Winckelmann to Freud and Beyond by Columbia University Press. He has written a visual culture trilogy published by Princeton, of which the third volume, Space, Time, and Depiction, is being finalized. A volume of essays on art historians and art historical schools of thought, Visions of Art History, is forthcoming soon from Edinburgh University. And lastly, he is also working on a book on the 19th century British queer reformer and critic John Addington Symonds and his relation to the traditions of ancient and modern moral philosophy concerning sex. And now please welcome Whitney Davis. Whitney, I turn this over to you.
Thank you very much, Shelby, and thank you very much to the Getty team, which has helped bring this presentation into being. And good evening, everyone. I say good evening because it's 7 p.m. in London, England, where I'm currently based, and happy Pride Month. As Shelby mentioned, my topic is ancient homoeroticism and modern queer beauty. And you see on the screen the 6 subject areas or topics I hope to cover this evening. I'll begin with some remarks about classical sculpture, that is, ancient Greek and Roman sculpture in the classical style. I'll then turn to make some remarks about ancient homoeroticism, usually known as pederasty, and I'll say something about what that means. And then we really dive into the meat of what I want to deal with tonight, namely modern visions of ancient homoeroticism from the Renaissance, but specifically from the 18th century to the present day. And then devote the second half of the talk to the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, using a couple of dramatic examples of my theme from each of those centuries. Next slide, please. So first, some orienting remarks about ancient Greek and Roman sculpture in the classical tradition. Here you see 2 marvelous works in bronze, the Victorious Youth, which is in the Getty Villa, and the so-called Adoring Youth, now in Berlin, both probably made around 300 BCE at the earliest. The classical style is well exemplified in these 2 works, and I'll be saying more about how modern art historians and critics and artists have responded to works like these. But first, let's just notice the extremely fine balance in these works between the ideal representation of a body, almost godlike in some respects, and its naturalism, the sense in which this person, this figure, this being could really turn and move in the real visual world along with us, the real beholders who are engaging with the sculpture. And in fact, I think one of the important features of the classical style, this naturalism so-called, is that it places us in a strong bodily and visual, even empathetic mental relationship to the depicted figure. even as if that figure were being seen by us, the real beholders, and responding in his or her own way to that looking. The victorious youth and the adoring youth were both probably dedications to an honored young man, perhaps a real young man, or perhaps a legendary heroic figure of some sort. Their specific contexts in their historical context are unknown to us now. But for our purposes, what's important is that they imply a dominant male viewer who is making erotic and social and ethical judgments about the man, the young man figured in these works. And similarly, they stage something like the response of that young man to being looked at. We could also say this about ancient representations of the female body, but that won't be my principal topic tonight. I will be focusing on the traditions of ancient male-to-male homoeroticism, but there could be much to say about male-female relations and female-female relations as they were figured in ancient art. But as I say, that won't be my theme tonight. Even though these figures appear to be quite real or naturalistic, they are also, I think, psychologically aloof. It's hard to know what's going on in their minds. And this, too, is an important feature of this classical style. It attracts the possibility of our projecting our own reactions and responses to these beings into the sculpture, reading into them psychological, possibly even erotic motivations and thoughts, although who knows what these figures are actually speaking or thinking of. The Getty victorious youth was a relatively recent discovery. It was found in the sea in 1964. And for that particular reason, it hasn't had much opportunity to have had a huge impact on modern arts and artists. The adoring youth, by contrast, was found on the island of Rhodes, close to the coast of Turkey, in the late 1400s. So it's been around for nearly 700 years. Its arms are, in fact, reconstructions of the early modern period. And insofar as this work has been around for a long time, he has passed through several major collections in Europe, the most important of which, for my purposes, was the collection of King Frederick II of Prussia, known as Frederick the Great, who installed this figure in the 1780s at his palace Sanssouci outside of Berlin. And he installed the figure in such a way that the young man with his arms raised appeared to be paying homage to the king himself. The statue is placed on a terrace facing the king's private quarters, as if this young man were, in a sense, representing the people of Prussia, the subjects of the king, who, for his part, is recognizing the beauty and honor of this person who is paying homage to him. Next slide, please. The classical style emerged in ancient Greece in the years after the Persian conflict with the Greeks ended in 479 BCE and persisted through the succeeding 100 or so years and remains still a live stylistic possibility for many artists today. On the left-hand side of the screen, you're seeing a work that might be thought of as one of the very first examples surviving to us of the classical style, the so-called Cratian boy. It's a marble original of about 475 BCE or so. It's now in the Acropolis Museum in Athens. He's about 2/3 life-size, or perhaps the size of a real boy of about 14 or 15 years old. This is an old photograph I've selected for its dramatic lighting, and you should note that the head has been recently reset in a slightly different orientation. The figure was found in two pieces on the Acropolis in 1865 and 1888. My colleague Richard Neer at the University of Chicago has nicely described the classical style as figured in this particular statue as offering a new way of yielding. And I hope the photograph makes it clear to you that the boy is, as it were, drawing back slightly, almost arching his back, almost as if he's drawing his breath in deeply. A reaction, perhaps, to the feeling that he's being watched. And indeed, he is being watched. He's being judged by dominant male viewers, who are bringing all of their critical, social, and indeed erotic and sexual opinions and judgments to the boy and to the sculpture of the boy. He is a post-adolescent youth at the cusp of manhood. On the right side of the screen, we have a slightly older youth, an athlete scraping himself, in Greek, the epoxyomenos. He's scraping off the oil and sand after his athletic exertions. This is a Roman copy of an original of about 350 BCE, so about 125 or so years later than the boy. Many, many plaster casts of this work were made in the modern period since the excavation of this statue in 1849. But we know something about its role in the ancient world. Supposedly, the Roman Emperor Tiberius loved this statue, or perhaps the image of the young man that it represented, so much that he had it moved from a public context in the city of Rome to his own bedroom. This work, since it's been available for more than a century and a half, as I mentioned, has been much admired and reproduced. And I'm showing you these two works as a pair just to give you a sense of the development of the classical style over here, several generations of artists, several generations of sculptors. You might feel that these works are becoming slightly more naturalistic as time goes on. Next slide, please. In the 18th century, the classical style in art was divided into two broad categories, which are represented nicely for us at the bottom half of the engraving on the screen on the left, where you see on the left bottom corner, the Apollo Belvedere in the Belvedere courtyard in the Vatican, and a representation of Apollo with a lyre. Both of them represent the high god Apollo, god of light, god of music. But in the high style on the left, I think you can see he's portrayed as athletic, muscular, almost domineering, emphasizing his masculine attributes. In the so-called beautiful style on the right, represented by Apollo with the lyre, he appears more graceful, perhaps with some almost feminine features, perhaps more youthful, perhaps more passive. And in the 18th century, these two sort of streams or strands of classical style in sculpture and painting were differentiated in terms of the erotic appeal of the male body to the implied male viewer. The Apollo Belvedere appeals erotically and ethically to our sense of a commanding masculine being, and the beautiful Apollo with a lyre on the right appeals perhaps to our sense of voluptuousness or pleasure or other kinds of feelings, perhaps equally but differently erotic. I use these examples because Apollo is an important motif replicated again and again in the art of the Renaissance down to the present day. Apollo had many male lovers, and that's part of the story of Apollo, and one of the reasons perhaps that he was specifically interesting to modern artists and writers who were interested in telling the story of Apollo. He had a specific attraction, it seems, for men and women who were interested in same-sex attractions. And I'm just quote for you a psychiatrist from Germany in the late 1890s who writes that sexual inverts, that is, men, also women, who are attracted primarily to members of their own sex. Sexual inverts, he writes, often ornament their apartments with pictures and statues representing good-looking youths. It appears that they love the statue of Apollo Belvedere in a manner all their own. The story of Apollo, as I mentioned, involved the history of his legendary relationships with young male lovers. And this is a theme that I now want to turn to, using as my segue a lithograph that appears on the right of your screen by an important French painter at the end of the 18th century, Regnault. This is a lithograph after a painting of him, showing or representing the education of Achilles, the great hero of the Iliad, by the centaur, who is teaching the young man at the cusp of manhood how to use the bow and arrow. And this nicely figures the relationship between a dominant older man who plays the role of teacher and mentor, but also possibly lover, with respect to a younger man. In Greek, an ephebe. An ephebe refers to an adolescent male just at the cusp of adulthood, just about to assume his full role as a citizen of the city-state, and specifically undergoing military training. So he's of a certain age where the cultivation of his body, of his physique, of his capabilities, but also of his moral character becomes an extremely important social issue for the city-state. And part of that education, that socialization, is entrusted not only to father and older brothers, but to a man outside of the family who occupies the role of teacher/lover. And I want to turn now to that particular institution, a very specific ancient Greek institution, which has puzzled modern scholars ever since it became fairly well understood in the 19th century. Next slide, please. Namely, ancient pederasty. Pederasty is the English translation of a Greek word which means love of boys. Really what is referred to here is love of ephebes, and under the definition that I just stated, or perhaps of somewhat younger boys, perhaps 15 or so years old, as in the Cretaean boy that we looked at. Here are two wonderful vase paintings from the later 500s BCE, that is before the Persian Wars, both in the Getty Museum collections, and they nicely illustrate some of the features of what we now know much more about, compared to what was known in the 18th century, the relations between these older and younger men that took on both a pedagogical, that is a teaching or mentoring aspect, and a romantic and potentially even a sexual aspect. On the left, we see an older man bending down to accept the embrace of a boy seated on some kind of a bench or perhaps a plinth. And it's clear that the man may be responding with some degree of surprise, but also perhaps welcoming this gesture of affection on the part of his younger companion. On the right, we see and I should mention that this nicely illustrates the intergenerational aspect of classic pederasty in its normative form as it come to be understood in the modern period since the Renaissance. An older man, an adult man, bearded, full citizen, fully adult, maybe even married with a family, and the boy entering adulthood who will eventually rise up to assume the same kind of social status as that man. And that relationship is cemented by affection and perhaps even by erotic and sexual activity. We also know from other vase paintings, such as the one on the right side of your screen, that the age relationship between the two men in question could be somewhat various. It could range from adult to mid-adolescent men, but here in this image on the right, we see an older as adolescent, perhaps a young man, and a slightly younger, shorter, smaller adolescent, maybe separated only by 5 years or so. And we also have vase paintings that depict men who are coevals. They are more or less the same exact age, young men of the same age. So there was a spectrum of possibility in the sort of love life, intermale love life of the ancient Greeks. But the specific institution of pederasty, the intergenerational relationship involving mentoring and affection, perhaps even sexual activity between the older and the younger man, was understood to be the normative form of ancient Greek eroticism by modern scholars and viewers. And for them, of course, that was a very striking and unusual social arrangement indeed, insofar as in the Judeo-Christian and then the modern legal traditions, sodomy of all kinds, but especially sex between people of the same gender, same-sex sexuality, was prohibited, often viciously and violently proscribed. So in the modern period, from the Renaissance forward, or let's say from the 18th century forward, this kind of ancient Greek arrangement would have seemed both potentially sinful and potentially illegal, but also clearly of central importance to the ethical and social life of the Greeks themselves. And insofar as the Greeks were admired for their philosophy, for their poetry, for their art, for their language, one had to struggle with what to do with this side of ancient Greek life that seemed so alien and perhaps inimical to modern standards. These vase paintings are now one of our primary sources for the institution of ancient pederasty and for some of the related kinds of eroticism in ancient Greece, both male-female and same gender. But the vases were actually not so well known to European scholars before about the middle of the 18th century. And really only it was at the end of the 19th century that the homoerotic vase paintings became much more widely known and the subject of scholarly analysis and debate, which enabled the visual evidence to be entered into the art historical and the historical record, which primarily had otherwise depended on literary evidence, myths, the dialogues of Plato, and other texts. So it's important to realize that many modern artists before about 1900 or so didn't necessarily have much access or any access at all to these kinds of representations of ancient pederasty, specifically in the vase painting tradition. They were able to respond to the sculptures that we've already seen, and they had to make the connection between pederasty as it's very specifically represented in these vase paintings and the much more oblique way in which it's stage managed in those sculptures that we saw, in the way that the Critian boy, for example, seems to be responding to an implied male viewer who is making some kind of set of judgments about his character and about his prowess and about potentially his physical beauty and his sexual allure. If you're interested in the ancient traditions of pederasty and related sexual arrangements and institutions, as documented by vase painting, a very rich and complex subject, I strongly recommend a book by Andrew Lear and Eva Cantarella called Images of Ancient Pederasty, which will give you a great deal of specific information and detail on these and other works. Next slide, please. But I want to turn now really to the question of the modern response to these traditions and representations as they were inherited in various ways from the ancient world, starting, for example, with discoveries like those in the 1400s and really picking up steam in the 18th and 19th century with more sustained and systematic excavation in Greece, Italy, and elsewhere. And I want to draw attention to two features of the way in which modern scholars and artists understood what they thought they were getting from these ancient representations. This is an interesting drawing, multicolored drawing by a relatively not so well-known American artist at the end of the 19th century named Carwin Linson. It depicts Pindar's Ode to Diagoras. Pindar was a great poet, and he was partly responsible, with other poets, of making poetic tributes to the athletic victors, the winners, in the Olympic and other games of Greece. Diagoras being one such young man. He was the winner of the boys' boxing match at the Olympic Games in 464 BCE. And Linson shows here the poet Pindar, the bearded man with his lyre, reciting his poem of praise to a group of young men about Diagoras, his praise of Diagoras, who presumably is that thoughtful young man sitting in the foreground, who's listening to the poet praising him to the other young men. And this image, I think, nicely figures a kind of psychological and social circuitry that is at the heart of the male-male social and erotic relationships of the ancient Greek world as understood by the moderns, namely the great importance of admiration and imitation. The poet is admiring the successful Diagoras. The boys listening to the poet praising Diagoras want to be like Diagoras. They want to be praised ultimately by a poet like Pindar. And Pindar, in his own way, wants to be praised for the beauty of his poem and the honor that he is, as a poet, bestowing on the young man. So you can see there's a whole sort of circuitry of imitative relationships that sort of bind together the community of men in this relationship of mutual admiration, but also, of course, potential mutual judgment and criticism. Next slide, please. And modern artists and scholars came to understand that this circuitry, this psychological and social circuitry, binding together the world of men through works of art, had an erotic dimension, a homoerotic dimension, in virtue of the fact that male sociability in ancient Greece included the institution of pederasty that I already mentioned. So that must necessarily be an inherent and necessary, but not a total and exclusive and sufficient condition of male sociability. And this image, I think, nicely represents that erotic dimension of this set of relationships I pointed to. It's an engraving by the French painter Henri Giraudet Triosson, working at the era of the French Revolution and then in the Napoleonic era, to the love poetry of the later Greek love poet Anacreon. What we see here is Giraudet's engraving to illustrate the 22nd ode of Anacreon. And I will just read you a snippet from that ode so you get a sense of the text which this picture is illustrating. And now with all thy pencil's truth, portray Bathyllus, lovely youth. Let his hair in lapses bright fall like streaming rays of light. Now from the sunny apple seek the velvet down that spreads his cheek, and there let beauty's rosy ray in flying blushes richly play. Then for his lips that ripely gem, but let thy mind imagine them. Oh, let this pictured God be mine. And all the elements that were narrated in that snippet from the ode itself are nicely represented here by Giraudet. We see Bathyllus, the actual lovely youth who is being admired, in the far background there, posing, as it were, perhaps against a column of some sort. In the foreground, we see the poet, Anacreon, the bearded man, leaning over the shoulder of the young man who was the artist, maybe whispering in his ear words of advice, not only about how to make the painting, but also about how to court, make love to the youth in the background. We see the painting itself being made, the lover's image of his beloved, and down in the corner, seated there at the feet of the artist, we see the little love god, Cupid, writing on the painting an inscription in Greek that translates Bathylos is beautiful, a kind of epithet that we find in Greek vase painting commonly. In fact, it was on one of the Getty vases that we saw earlier. So here we see, again, the elements of imitation, but with the erotic dimension clearly and vividly factored in. And this leads me to my topic of queer beauty. Next slide, please. In the 18th century, this possibility that the ethical and erotic nature of male-male sociability could be extracted from works of ancient art gradually became more and more closely focused or available to modern scholars and artists. The principal character in this story is the mid to late 18th century German art historian and antiquarian Johann Winckelmann, born in 1717 and murdered, unfortunately, at a relatively young age in 1768 in northern Italy when he was returning to his homeland in Prussia, in fact, to be praised and honored by Frederick the Great, whom we just saw in an earlier slide. Winckelmann, in his essays and then in his magisterial History of Ancient Art, which is perhaps fairly taken to be one of the founding texts of professional art history ever since, Winckelmann recognized not only the stylistic differentiations, beautiful style and high style, that I just mentioned in the classical tradition, he also recognized these social circuitries, both ethical or broadly social, and specifically erotic and homoerotic, that I've sketched using the two pictures by Linssen and Giraudet. He pulled these possibilities out of the art historical record, but also of the record of texts, and put them together in a striking and convincing fashion that really launched the modern artistic and scholarly response to ancient homoeroticism, but under the terms that Winckelmann had developed in this set of responses. On the right, on the left of your screen, we see one of the works of art that especially fascinated him from the ancient world. It's a relief of the Roman Antinous, who was the lover or the beloved of the Roman Emperor Hadrian, died or drowned in the Nile and was later made a god by the emperor. And many figurations of Antinous of various descriptions were produced in virtue of this deification of the now deceased beloved of the emperor. And we see him here in a marvelous high relief, now in the Villa Albani in Rome. Alessandro Albani was a cleric in the Roman Catholic Church, and Winckelmann served as his art advisor toward the end of his life. In the Villa Albani, still outside of Rome, still today, you can see this relief as it was installed in a rather Baroque salon over a fireplace. It depicts the beautiful young man carrying a sheaf of lotuses, which probably signifies his untimely end in the Nile. For Winckelmann, it was important that although this figure is idealized, he also has a tinge of much really beautiful style in him, certain amount of voluptuousness, sensuality, and sexiness, which the Roman beholder would have immediately understood as part and parcel of Hadrian's erotic and sexual attraction to him, something that perhaps many modern viewers wouldn't be able to pick up unless they knew the story of the relationship between Antinous and Hadrian. On the right is an example of the high style, the more, as it were, aggressively muscular and masculine style that Winckelmann also identified in the classical tradition. He thought this was one of the most striking and helpful exemplifications of that style. He believed that it's actually a tiny little gemstone, so it's only about the size of a postage stamp. He believed it represents an athlete pulling a javelin out of his thigh. We now know he's probably scraping himself after athletic exertions, like the Apoxyomenos we saw earlier. But insofar as Winckelmann's reading of this motif, he's pulling the weapon out of his body. An important feature of the classical style that I've already mentioned leaps to the fore. Despite this extremely painful situation, the young man is virtually expressionless. He's holding himself with great fortitude and courage, bravery, but also not showing any of his emotions clearly to the viewer. Part and parcel of this template, if you like, this screen for projection that the classical style enables for us. Next, please. Now, Winckelmann was alert to the homoerotic textures and valences of these ancient images. That was one of his specific interests. But it was not possible for him to state those interpretations in quite the direct manner that I've been doing so far with you and that you would find in 20th century scholarship on these objects. He had to go about his interpretations, at least in public, in a sort of roundabout manner. And therefore, it's quite hard to know how many of his readers, such as artists and scholars who were responding to his researches, how many of his readers really could pick up what he was driving at in excavating some of the possibilities of homoerotic significance in ancient art. But for my purposes, what's especially interesting is that it didn't really matter so much that the specific homoerotic background of these works was identifiable, because Winckelmann succeeded in successfully establishing the classical style, even given its homoerotic dimensions, as the recommended norm, the canonical norm for modern artists. So these works, as it were, crept out of their homoerotic shelters into a much more public domain where they came to possess what I call queer beauty. They do figure homoerotic themes, but they're important to the modern world, not so much for that, but for their aesthetic beauty, a kind of aestheticization, idealization, stylization of these possibilities in the classical the idiom of the classical style. And in the later 18th century, this kind of classicism recommended by Winckelmann really took off among educated men and women all across Europe and beyond, especially in the aristocracy, and significantly changed the taste and even the self-image of many young men growing up in Germany, Scandinavia, England at the time. And that transformation, it's opened up by the introduction of the Winckelmannian aesthetics, if you like, is nicely illustrated here by the two portraits of aristocratic young men on the screen, separated by about 130 years or so, one from the 17th century and one from the era immediately contemporary with Winckelmann. In the first, on the right, we see the conventional pre-Winckelmannian iconography of a rich and successful man, his ownership of land, his arms, references to hunting and other activities. On the right, we see a young man, in fact, a tourist traveling in Italy from one of the northern countries, Germany or England perhaps, gesturing to a replica of, among other things, the Villa Albani Antinous relief on a table. And he's as if he's saying to the viewer, I've been to Italy. I am very up to date, up to the minute. I recognize the aesthetic importance and significance of these works that I am now acknowledging as part of my self-cultivation, my education as a man of the world, a man of taste, a man of parts. Now building into that very identity, this homoerotic possibility, which is built into the classical style and which has now become a recommended artistic norm and ideal in general, whether or not the homoerotic valence was fully appreciated by each and every beholder. Next slide, please. In the 19th century, this possibility that ancient works of art that had potentially homoerotic significances could contribute structurally to the coming into being, the becoming, the maturation of young men, forming their character, their subjectivity, their very sense of their innermost being, became more and more dramatic. I'm using here the example of the first really, I would say, influential work of sex reform advocacy or polemicizing of a modern author. Karl Heinrich Ulrich in the mid-19th century produced a string of tracts essentially recommending that homosexual men and women should no longer be held criminally responsible for their sexual feelings and actions, which were, he believed, inborn in them for whatever reason or however caused, but in such a way that they weren't making a choice for which they could be held criminally responsible or even be held as sinning. This was an extremely important set of legal and social arguments. Ulrich himself described his own sexual awakening, his own coming to understand himself as gay, in our modern term, or queer. He described the origin of this in his early adolescence as due to his encounter with works of classical art, in both in their original form and in their various reproductions and publications. Here we see the definitive event in his own self-formation. In a handbook of modern architecture, he discovered an illustration, a modern line drawing, of one of the reliefs, stone reliefs, carved on the metopes, the panels that decorate the sides of the Temple of Athena, the Parthenon in Athens. This is, you're looking at a modern drawing of that ancient work in a modern architectural handbook. Thumbing through this architectural handbook, probably the age of 12 or 14, he found this picture, and he writes in Memnon, an autobiographical text in part, "This picture awakened me through the figure of a Greek god or hero in the nude." He didn't really understand what the iconography of this image in ancient terms might have been, and I don't need to go into that here. And he continues, "This picture in the book, put away from me 100 times, came again 100 times before the eyes of my soul." 5-10 years later, Ulrich embarks on his career as a advocate for the kind of sex reform that I'm speaking of, but predicated on his self-discovery through classical traditions and classical narratives and classical motifs, that he reads into a homoerotic significance, whether or not the ancient image really entails that or really trails that in its wake. Next slide, please. And we find this particular scenario reiterated over and over and over again in 19th century queer autobiographies, memoirs, and introspective narratives. A second example, a very good example, is the example of John Addington Symonds, the British art critic, wrote a monumental history of the Renaissance, among other works, working in the second half of the 19th century. He too experienced his self-becoming as gay, as queer, in relationship to his discovery of ancient works of art, which had for him this homoerotic significance. The Lysippon Apoxyomenos, the sculpture we'd already seen in the Vatican, greatly impressed him when he saw it in Rome, because it reminded him of young men that he'd actually seen in his hometown, Bristol in England, actual young men working in the docks or in the fields and at church and elsewhere, young men that he secretly lusted after. But he dates the origin of his understanding, his self-understanding of these feelings, to his encounter of a photograph of an ancient artwork, probably in the beautiful style, that he encountered in a book in his father's library, again, at the age of 12 or 14 or so. And he writes in his memoirs, a photograph of Praxiteles' Cupid, somewhat like the little Cupid we saw perhaps in Girodet's drawing. A photograph of Praxiteles, the sculptor's Cupid, taught me to feel the secret of Greek sculpture. I used to pore for hours over the divine loveliness, while my father read poetry aloud to our family in the evenings. He did not quite approve and asked me to choose another statue, perhaps a nymph, a female representation of a female figure. This photograph strengthened the ideal I was beginning to form of adolescent beauty. It prepared me to receive the Apoxyomenos. I was certainly a rather singular boy. What I really wanted was some honest youth or comrade who would have introduced me to the love of a robust and manly lad. And if you're interested in Symonds's later experiences, gradually more and more self-confident and wide-ranging in homoerotic subcultures in Britain and beyond, I strongly recommend you simply go and read his memoirs. So Symonds is responding to the impact of classical art and its homoerotic valences on himself, but he's also very aware of the possibility that the reproduction, the replication of this art by modern artists, that is British artists of the later 19th century, could open a door to the, if you like, introduction of homoeroticism into modern society. It's a great idea, right? If you make works of art that carry this significance, and these works of art are appreciated because of their aesthetic beauty, then on a sort of second hand, you're creating the possibility of opening up the homoerotic subtext or undergrowth of these images. He thought a number of modern artists were capable of doing this and were doing this. And I just show you one example on the right screen. A personal friend of his, Henry Scott Tuke, a long-lived artist, quite successful in the British art scene, lived as late as 1929. This is a painting of 1900, now lost. So you're seeing a black and white photograph of it as it was exhibited at the Royal Academy exhibitions in London in 1900. And he depicts the Greek messenger god Hermes, or Mercury, at a pool. But it's important to know that Tuke painted these figures from life in the open air using real English boys, lads, as his models. And in fact, this young man was very well known and intimate with Tuke himself, a young man in Johnny Jacket, who became affectionately and perhaps intimately involved with Tuke for a number of years. And he's here being posed as Hermes at the pool. You can see that this relationship between Tuke and the model, between the model, the picture, and the tradition that I've been pointing to, evokes possible homoerotic responses. It permits a male beholder, if they so desired, to read these kinds of possibilities into it. But you can also see that Tuke is staying on the side of decency. What's kind of publicly acceptable, legible? So no frontal genital nudity, for example. And that creates a certain degree of formal awkwardness, I think, that the ancient sculptors didn't have to avoid or didn't have to deal with, because they were not in any sense trying to somehow second guess or censor themselves in the art that they were producing. Whereas Tuke, of course, is aware that there could be unfavorable commentary about this picture and possibly even about the nature of the relationship he might have with the model. So you see this kind of awkward pose. Also, I don't think it's entirely successful, even reading from the black and white photograph. The skin coloring and the pose seems awkwardly configured. If you're interested in all of this, there's a very good essay by Andrew Stevenson in a recent anthology of essays on Tuke, which explains very well how Tuke, I think, and Stevenson thinks, was struggling with the potentials of the interpretation of his painting. And that leaves marks in his own aesthetic achievement. He's not able to pull it quite together because there's so much going on in the background, as it were. Next slide, please. Symonds was also very close to another artist of the same day, Ronald Sutherland Gower. Gower was openly and well known to be queer in our modern sense. He had a number of homoerotic relationships and had a kind of a reputation for this. But as a member of the high aristocracy, of the landed gentry and aristocracy of England, he was more or less immune from the kind of criticism or even prosecution that would have afflicted men of lesser social standing. I'm showing you here an interesting work by Gower, his monument to Shakespeare, the Shakespeare Memorial, now in the Bancroft Gardens in Stratford-upon-Avon in England, Shakespeare's birth town and the site of the Shakespeare Theatre. You're seeing a close-up of one of the four figures ranged around this core of this memorial, on the top of which is a seated figure of William Shakespeare. Prince Hal, the allegory of history. Prince Hal, King Henry V, the subject of Shakespeare's Henry V, as well as a character in Henry IV, Part 2. Gower based this figure, like Tuke, on a naked model, a real young man in his studio, and he even considered leaving the Prince Hal on the monument in the nude, although there's no support in Shakespeare's text of Henry V or of Henry IV, Part 2 for doing so. But you can see, I think, that he's strongly emphasizing these secondary sex characteristics, the buttocks, the genitals of this young man, figuring the king to be with his tight-fitting clothing. That's nicely shown to you in the two photos that I took on the right of the screen. I should point out that the statue, if you visit there now, is now disarticulated from the core, and it sits about 30 feet away from the core of the memorial. So you can actually walk all the way around him, which is what my photographs are showing you. In the original installation, as you see on the left, you wouldn't have been able to do that. And that'd be one of the perhaps senses in which Gower is carefully staging some of the aspects of what he wants to represent. Prince Hal, of course, stands for England. He represents the body politic. But nonetheless, Gower doesn't shy away from sexualizing his body. Next slide, please. But like Tuke, he has to be careful about the degree to which this homoerotic valence, I hope you've noticed that Prince Hal is based on The Adoring Youth in Berlin. That's a prototype that Gower explicitly referred to. He visited Berlin to check it out. Gower inscribes a text from the relevant play by Shakespeare above the figure, "Consideration like an angel came and whipped the offending Adam out of him." The offending Adam is sin, especially sin in sex, the original sin of sexual knowledge that Adam transmitted to the rest of humanity. But as the Archbishop of Canterbury says about Prince Hal in the play, Hal put aside his romps of youth, and especially his eroticized, pederastic, possibly relationship with the knight Falstaff depicted in the plays. He put those aside when he understood that he was going to assume the kingship. He's accepting the crown from the deathbed of his dying father, Henry IV. That's what's specifically shown in the sculpture. And the inscription is meant to remind him that these escapades and sexual antics of Prince Hal's rowdy youth are no longer really part of his national identity as King of England. They're part of his subjectivity, his character, if you like, but they're also part of his past. He's surmounted them. He's transcended them. So again, here we see an interesting sort of dynamic of how to handle the homoerotic aspects that clearly interested Gower as a person, his own character and subjectivity deeply involved with homoerotic subcultures of his time and place. But in this public work of art, he's working with queer beauty, in my sense. He's aestheticizing, he's idealizing, he's moving away to some degree from the specific homoerotic valences. Next, please. Now we move into the 20th century, and a number of different factors come into play. Up through the end of the Victorian period, the end of the 19th century, the classical style, as recommended by Winkelmann as the norm, the ideal, the canon for modern artists, remained and reigned supreme. But as you all know, at the end of the 19th century, modernist experiments in the arts began to gain ground from post-impressionism and post-impressionism onwards. So 20th century artists have a different relationship to the classical tradition. Some continue to use it, make use of its resources, both as a style, but also for its range of meanings that it encodes. Others, of course, deeply resist it, react against it. André Derain is an interesting example of this, and I show you a nice drawing by him. Derain was a French modernist painter of the first part of the 20th century. He had a kind of classicizing moment in the 1920s. Many of his works are significantly more modernist looking than this. It's a life drawing. It's a drawing after the nude model, using some of the conventions of the classical style of naturalistic posing of the body, which I'm just reminding you of in those two little diagrams on the right. But the figure also incorporates, I think, some features of a modernist style. You can see the figure is not entirely convincing naturalistically. It's a very, very almost a counter-naturalistic pose of the left leg in relation to the forward foot. You try doing that in your living room and you'll see how difficult it is. Derain is actually making a picture, I believe, of a well-known queer icon, a real person of the day. And that's the second factor, in addition to modernism, to make reference to in the 20th century. By the 20th century, actual young men of all ages, could begin to figure and represent themselves as queer in more public contexts. And this then becomes part of their identity as they are going to be represented by photographers, painters, and sculptors. So we've got, as it were, two levels of queerness now in the 20th century. We've got the queer self-recognized identity of the subjects being portrayed, and we've got the queer valences of the portrayal of them, brought to that portrayal by the artist and projected into it by the beholders and all of their diverse opinions. This subject, I believe, I've got an identification that I've defended in print, was a great ballet dancer, Leonid Massine, then went on to be a major choreographer in the later 20th century. The lover of Sergei Diaghilev, the impresario who ran the Russian ballet, the Ballet Russe, which toured Europe in the teens and 20s. And Leonid Massine was a queer icon for audiences, ballet lovers, and artists of that period, Derain among them, although I don't know that Derain is responding to him specifically as queer, but this would have been known about him. He was the lover of Diaghilev and also the model for other artists, including a wonderful portrait of him by Picasso that's in the Art Institute of Chicago. So yet another layer here, modernism, but also modern queerness, modern subjectivity that's evolved since the later 19th century, in part due to the legal reforms kicked off by writers like Ulrichs in the 1860s and 70s. Next, please. Now, in fact, some of these iconic artworks are nodes for queer community, queer sociability in the real world. The works of art have, in a sense, re-entered the homoerotic spaces, which they were originally constituted in the classical style in ancient Greece, passed through a series of revisions and modifications in the 18th and 19th centuries, and then re-emerge with a kind of renewed queer vitality in real sociability, in real queer communities of our own day. I show you the interesting example of Hermann Hubacher's statue of Ganymede. Ganymede was the Trojan prince who was abducted by the high god Zeus and carried off to heaven, to Olympus, to serve as his cupbearer serving Zeus wine for the rest of eternity, and as his bedfellow, his pederastic beloved, young male beloved. And Zeus here is represented in the figure, the avatar of the eagle, which the boy is gesturing at. This work is now on the waterfront in Zurich, where I am partly based. Was put there in 1952 as a gift to the city of Zurich by the great art historian Heinrich Wöfflin, a Swiss art historian who in the first part of the 20th century was maybe the most influential art historian living and working at that time. Wöfflin thought that the city of Zurich had, as he put it in a letter to the sculptor, too many female nudes, too many sculptures of females in public places, and it needed a male nude. And he commissioned Hubacher to make this figure, which he then donated to the city. From then until the present moment, this figure has been a kind of stopping off point for queer tourists, queer families, queer weddings, queer friendships, queer betokenings of love and friendship. And you can see one result of that here, the constant rubbing of the big toe of the Ganymede by real passersby, rubbing it so frequently and so often that the patina has never formed and you're looking through to the original bronze surface. Go to Zurich on a sunny afternoon in the springtime and you will see what I mean. This figure has attracted around itself a kind of vibrant pride community. Next, please. I want to end very briefly with the example of Robert Mapplethorpe, the famous American photographer who died of AIDS in the AIDS epidemic in the later part of the 20th century, probably so well known to most of you that I don't need to say much about him. Here's a wonderful photograph of one of his models, James Dietz, photo of 1983 in the Getty collections. I'm just juxtaposing it with the blow up of the Critian boy that we saw earlier in this presentation to show you how Mapplethorpe is making use of this kind of reference point in classical sculpture, but also potentially queer subjectivity. Whether or not James Dietz himself as the model was queer or not, that's probably not so relevant to Mapplethorpe's dynamics in the photo, although it might be relevant to our responses to it. It's also a very good example of Mapplethorpe's extremely educated and sophisticated uptake of the classical style. And I'll just end with a slide. Next slide, please. That nicely indicates some of the textures of that aspect of his very protean and creative production. On the left is a photograph of his loft in Lower Manhattan, Midtown Manhattan. And you can see beside the fireplace to our left, a plaster replica of an ancient statue, a Greek or Roman statue of Antinous, the beloved of Hadrian, whom we saw in the Antinous relief. But you also see other works in Mapplethorpe's collection that collectively, I think, as well as the setup of the photograph itself, I think collectively represent his extreme formalization and extremely classic aestheticization of the frame itself and of the staging of the works within it. On the right, we see artwork based on queer materials in his own personal collection. In this case, photographic magazines of youthful male models photographed in the nude almost in the so-called physique pictorial magazines of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Outmoded, in a sense, by the time Mapplethorpe comes along, but objects of great interest to him. And this is an artwork using the May 1964 cover of the Grecian Guild pictorial, which I think nicely puts a seal on my narrative tonight. Mapplethorpe, in a very sophisticated, self-referential and subtle way, but also a very personal, I think, moving, almost self-exposing way, is attaching himself to the classical tradition and its homoerotic dimensions in this work. And I think probably aware of almost all of the wide range of reference that I've indicated so far. My hour is up. Thank you very much for your attention. And we look forward, Shelby and I, to hearing your questions and to addressing any clarifications or questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Whitney, thank you so much for that immense trajectory. That was really illuminating. We have a number of questions. I don't think I can go in a particular order, but I'm just going to start at the top and see what happens. And then if they start to clump into similar questions, I'll merge some of them. You have one question about the canon of classical beauty and whether you think it can ever be fully queered, or does its foundational role in Western aesthetics limit its potential?
That's an excellent question. The classical tradition is limited in what it can be used to do aesthetically and morally for us today, and since the 18th century, if not before. In part, the society from which it springs was a patriarchal, masculinist, to some degree strongly misogynist, slave-owning society. Many aspects of its social institutions and social organizations are not a model for us today. And so the recuperation or the recapturing of the homoerotic strand by a certain number of queer artists and thinkers is a kind of very specific way of relating to the classical tradition. And it also has to be said that many queer artists, increasingly in the 20th century, have no interest whatsoever in the classical tradition. It is worth remembering, though, that as I said, through the end of the 19th century, it was almost impossible for an artist working in a figurative mode who wanted some degree of public recognition and success not to be educated in the classical style and not to use these kinds of motifs and formal devices that we've been looking at. We've moved on from that, but much of our own 18th and 19th century European American artistic heritage has this built into it.
Another questioner says that I love the idea of these sculptures anticipating the erotic gaze of the viewer. How might this gaze have shifted when regarding adult, more heroic male nudes, such as the Lansdowne Heracles?
Yes, also a very good question. I think the different male nudes, ranging from those rather languorous and soft or more passive looking, beautiful young men, might have solicited a certain kind of reaction on the part of the beholder. And a work like the Lansdowne Heracles, which for viewers, audience who don't know, that is a much more masculine, powerful figure of the overbuilt Hercules. It's been argued that works like that might have actually intimidated viewers, or some viewers. They would have been frustrating, perhaps, for some viewers, because nobody's going to have a body like that unless they're Hercules, or they're spend all their time doing the weight training. My colleague at Berkeley, Andy Stewart, who passed away a couple of years ago, has a wonderful book that kind of revolves around this subject. The kind of pros and cons of one's being attracted to, but also maybe repelled by different aspects of these different sculptures. And I don't want to make it sound as if they're self-evidently desirable and all adult male viewers would have had the same kind of erotic and social reaction. There's going to be a spectrum of reactions to a spectrum of different kinds of possibilities. We want to keep that in mind.
There are a couple of questions that relate to museum display. You are not a museum curator, but you might want to answer whether you think that modern discomfort with ancient homoerotic practices influence how museums display or contextualize objects.
Absolutely. The vases that you saw were not the specific examples from the Getty, but that kind of object was known to European audiences from about 1800 forward. And by about 1860 or so, the pederastic narratives on some of those vase scenes were also known, but museums had great difficulty putting those on public display, especially when it became more and more clear to scholars and artists and others that there were these homoerotic narratives. So those works were often sequestered. They were put in secret collections. When I was a student in Harvard in the 1970s, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, of all places, had what it called an X collection, which contained the sexy vases of the ancient world. Same with the sculptures. There was all kinds of controversies through the last few centuries about how they should be exhibited, how you were able to see them, what parts of them were being able or were seeable. And we saw that in the Gower Prince Hal it's not a museum display object, but it's got that same dynamic. What are we being allowed to see, and what are we being able to interpret from what we're being allowed to see? This has been an ongoing problem, and I don't think it's necessarily gone away. There are controversial and often politically and socially and legally controversial aspects of the representation of male-male sexual sociability in the ancient world that some museums, even today in some parts of Europe and the United States, are going to have great difficulty contending with possible public responses. You all probably know that Mapplethorpe himself, a show of his work in Cincinnati, was put on trial by the municipal authorities who were reacting negatively to or partly to the sexual content of those pictures. Maybe we haven't advanced as far as we might like, in fact, in those kinds of considerations. Huge issue.
There's a question about why the artist Corwin Linson showed two women in his drawing of the poet Pindar reciting the ode. And does this not dilute the narrative, or is it intentionally to disguise the homosocial context?
I've been wondering about that myself, and I've been doing some work on Corwin Linson, who's kind of not Corbin Linson, who's not so well known. It strikes me that that might be a sort of gesture to the known fact that female-female love relationships were also the subject of canonically beautiful Greek poetry from known to the modern world in the figure of the poet Sappho and her love poems to her female beloveds, and the possibility that female relationships in the ancient, but more likely in the modern world, could be structured on that possibility in the same kind of way that the male-male relationships could be structured. That's sort of giving Linson the benefit of the doubt. The other way of looking at it is that, yes, he is trying to sort of heterosexualize or heteronormativize to some degree the community that he's figuring in that picture. It's very unlikely that female audiences of Pindar's odes to athletic victors would have been kind of the reality in the ancient situation. So it is some kind of a reflection of Linson's response to his modern context and what he wants his viewers to pull out from that. It's a very good question. If I knew the answer, I would be writing an essay about Linson, but give me a year, maybe I'll get there.
There's another specific question about an artwork. Do the homoerotic depictions of Saint Sebastian in Renaissance art proceed from the classical tradition, or do they represent a different strand of homoeroticism in Western art?
Another interesting question, because I didn't want to layer this talk too much with the pre-18th century, early modern and Renaissance homoerotic material, of which the iconography of the saints, including Saint Sebastian, but also the iconography of figures in the Bible, like Jesus's beloved friend, John, figurations of the relationship between Jesus and John, strike modern eyes as often having a strongly homoerotic dimension to them. And some of those representations are indeed based on the classical possibilities known to Renaissance artists from the 15th century, if not before, figures on ancient sarcophagi and other examples of ancient art that had survived into the late Middle Ages and the modern world that those artists could reference. But also, as the question is rightly suggesting, other kinds of stylistic traditions that are not classical, that come out of the medieval traditions of spiritualizing the figure and representing the principal themes of Christian art. So there's a kind of an interesting mix of the classical and the Christian in that material. John Addington Symonds thought that was the most important feature of Renaissance art, this sort of dynamic tension between those two world historical traditions, faiths, styles, but also, of course, views about sexuality, the classical and the Christian. So that's sort of a different story that requires a kind of a different set of tools than I'm using for the 18th century and later.
Are there examples of classical homoeroticism used by artists responding to the AIDS epidemic? And if so, what might that reference have symbolized?
You could look at some of the later photographs of Mapplethorpe when he was would eventually die of AIDS-related complications. He is there directly grappling with his condition and the epidemic and the situations of his friends, and nonetheless using this full vocabulary formally and from narratives and motifs of the classical material that he's familiar with, and he's based a lot of his kind of formatting of the picture around. So he'd be a good example of that. I think you could maybe come up with other examples. I haven't done so much work on that period in American art, so I don't want to jump the gun. But one of the features of this whole homoerotic strand in modern art since the 18th century is to remember that for modern men and modern society, these possibilities are lost, right? This is a defunct sociability, which is sort of an ideal we have that we could reconstruct something like it in the 20th century world. But all of this work comes with an aura of melancholy and loss from the modern point of view. And that, of course, feeds directly in to the sensibility of artists in the AIDS crisis. That, you know, just when we thought liberation had been achieved post-Stonewall, there is this apocalyptic epidemic, and this entire community, this entire possibility of subjecthood, of belonging, is being destroyed. And the classical tradition, at least in the modern era, has that sort of aspect within it. There's a resource there for some artists, and you could perhaps go through some of the art of that era and look at that kind of possibility.
It's hard to pick out questions. There are so many and they're so different. Here's one, thanking you for this talk and working backwards from the queer lexicon of today, wondering, do the classical and modern examples you've examined today pave the way to contemporary types within the gay community? How might contemporary notions of twinks or daddies and trade, for instance, build upon the visual traditions you've traced?
Also very, very thoughtful and good question. I think that some aspects of modern vocabulary in which the intergenerational possibilities of sociability and sexual connections between lovers, partners of the same gender are figured, that I think can resource itself in the classical tradition. A very good example of that can be found in the work of the queer theorist Leo Bersani, responding in part to the work of the French historian and theorist of sexuality Michel Foucault, who in turn referenced the example of ancient pederasty as a kind of new model of relationship for modern men who weren't necessarily raised to believe that that was a possibility, non-heteronormative, non-nuclear family, non-same generational, et cetera, non-procreative, et cetera, et cetera. So that particular structure of ancient sociability is referenced, I think, quite frequently by modern queer cultures. Maybe perhaps daddy boy, maybe perhaps the twink implied, you know, orienting themselves to an older male lover who's admiring them and praising them and trying to seduce them, perhaps. And the twink themselves has a relationship to all of that. Those, I think, to me, have a classical feel. Other kinds of institutions of queer sociability today, I don't think you could root them so clearly in these classical Greek institutions. But we ought to remember that none of these kinds of relationship or relationality are absolutely new, right? They all have an ancestry going back through the 20th century and before. And so they all, in some way or another, are going to intersect with the classical tradition. Leather iconography, leather etiquette might be another area where we could talk about this. But good question. I think yes and no. Let's say partly rooted in the classical tradition, partly trying to establish new relationalities away from that. You know, let's get something else.
We're coming, unfortunately, to close to the end. Let's take a couple more questions and then we'll have to say goodbye. Here's one that goes back to the past. Since Greek male nudes generally reflect a toned, if not clearly athletic body, do you, or Near, see ancient images of slender and less muscular youths as having an intentionally different appeal from just a beautiful young athlete?
Yes. So some of those figures that you saw in the sculptures are highly cultivated with physiques that could only be obtained through athletic training in gymnastics, running, boxing, and so on. Other of those figures have physiques that are cultivated through the military training, which was standard for all young men. And still others have this kind of more boyish, pre-military, pre-athletic victor, pre-kind of full masculine sexual development at the age of 18 or so. There are figures that have a more pubescent look. And all of those different possibilities have a certain kind of erotic allure to male beholders within the classical system. So I think that our Getty youth you see here on the screen, the victorious youth, he is not, I would say, especially muscular and developed. He belongs to that more slender type that you're referencing. And similarly, the Hermes that Tuke painted, Johnny Jacket, his model, is not a bodybuilder. He's a lean, wiry English fishing village lad. And the answer to that is yes, there are different kinds of body types and different kinds of viewers and appeals that they're trading on. It is very noteworthy, however, that lots of men of all ages in Greece must have not had ideal body types by any of these standards. And we don't see those in Greek painting and sculpture unless they're figures of fun or satire, or they're meant to represent some kind of exotic, grotesque, or monstrous type of body. Nowadays, we would object to that, right? That kind of idealization and stereotyping and objectification of certain bodies. And we need to remember that that's basically what the classical tradition in art is doing to some degree. And it's doing that with an erotic charge.
Thank you. And our last question it's a very large one. Could you talk a little bit more about the separation of beauty from sexuality in formal art history and how that has affected interpretation?
It's affected interpretation structurally right down to the ground. So that separation was enacted most notoriously by the philosopher Immanuel Kant in the 1790s in his Critique of Aesthetic Judgment, where he argues that the ideal of beauty in the fine arts, painting and sculpture, needs to divest itself of any form of erotic or economic or political or religious or other interest in the object being portrayed. It needs to be solely a vehicle of beauty, sort of contaminated by sex or money or politics or anything else. And for Kant, this is what the beautiful in art should strive to attain. This is clearly impossible, right? The artist, modern art is partly about this. You can't separate beauty from what interests us in beauty. And it might be an economic or it might be a sexual dimension. But that separation has indeed strongly affected the history of art, criticism, museums, and we're still, I think, wrestling with it. There probably still isn't sufficient acknowledgement of the ground level role of sexuality as a form of aesthetics, right? To love beauty is to be in an erotic relationship with an object, an animal, something in nature. And there are large paths of art history that have been uncomfortable with that idea, because then when you're talking about art or beauty, you inevitably have to start addressing the messy business of these kinds of attractions, some of which may be prohibited or prescribed legally or morally within the culture that the art historians are working in. My book, Sexuality and Aesthetics, is sort of about that tension, and in every major art historian that I've ever worked on, you can find this tension. It's an animating one that really has motivated a lot of creative work, but it's also very disabling because it has meant the sort of fundamental structural feature of aesthetic experience is constantly being kind of evaded by people who should know better, by art historians.
Unfortunately, we have reached the end of our program. Whitney, I can't thank you enough for this vast art history lesson and for making this trajectory from past to present so clear. Thank you, viewers, for joining us and for all your questions. Everyone can visit getty.edu for information about future programs. And we will thank you and say we hope to see you again at a future program. And goodbye.